Thank you for joining us, everyone. Today we have the guest online already. Her name is Kirsten Ahern, and she is an Ayurvedic health counselor. She is going to be talking today about Ayurvedic basics and then going into a little more specifics. So I'm going to hand it over to Kirsten. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning in this virtual new reality that we all live in. I can see that everyone sort of settled into this new reality so well, which is very important to coming into what we do in Ayurveda, which is living in rhythm, living in the flow of life and everything that's going on, and just learning to adapt and to stay resilient amidst all the things that we have in our environment. So as Nicole said, my name is Kirsten Ahern. I'm an Ayurvedic health counselor. I'm also a 500-hour certified yoga instructor and a leadership and talent development counselor. And just very happy to be here with Mary Center this morning. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slideshow. So for those of you on the phone, don't worry that you're not seeing the slides. Because I'm going to talk through absolutely everything, and then you can always go back and watch the video later as well. And so this is my business here, Ka Ayurveda. I'm the founder of Ka Ayurveda here in Washington, D.C. And we will be talking about generals about Ayurveda and introduction to Ayurveda today, as well as my understanding is you have some particular interest in digestion in Ayurveda. And so we'll do a brief overview of that. And so just a little bit about Ayurveda. Ayurveda literally translates to the science or the knowledge of life. This is an ancient science, thousands of years old, that we now find today here in the West, practiced broadly, widely, and very commonly. It is the healing side of yoga. And so through the ages, Ayurveda was practiced alongside yoga. In fact, they're sister sciences. You can't really have one without the other. And when we talk about yoga, oftentimes we think about the physical asana practice of yoga, but what we're referring to here is the practice of reaching enlightenment or spirituality or liberation, right? And so the ancient yoga practice was intended to take us to a place where we would move beyond that feeling of I am body, I am mind, and move into the place of spirit. And so it's often said that Ayurveda was there to heal the body, while yoga was there to heal the mind, to both lead us to the place of eventual liberation and enlightenment. And so it is a holistic mind, body, spirit approach to health and well-being. We do not just treat the ailments in the body, you know, your sore joints or your bad digestion or whatever it is. We view everything as interconnected. So it's not just what you eat. Oftentimes it's how you eat it and the environment in which you're eating it. And, you know, all of these things come together in many, many different ways. And I'm sure each and every one of you have probably experienced it before, where, you know, if you were upset, maybe you lost your appetite, or maybe you didn't digest your food well. We know that all of these things are interconnected, and even modern science is now showing us today that there's no division between the mind, body, spirit connection. And so I would just very briefly like to go over what the causes of disease are in Ayurveda so that we understand why imbalances come into our body. And so these are just very basic causes of disease. And the first one is the misuse of the senses. And what we mean by the misuse of the senses is literally the five senses, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're smelling, what we're touching, what we're tasting. How we take all of those senses and use them to either bring things that are harmonious into the body or things that are disharmonious into the body and into the mind. And so I think this also probably makes sense if you eat something that doesn't agree with you and you end up with burning indigestion, or you end up with lots of gas or elimination type issues, you know that you've probably misused your sense of taste, right? I think that makes sense. But then also oftentimes what we're looking upon, what we're viewing on TV, what we're seeing on the news, for example, things like that can actually cause disease in the body just as much as eating something that doesn't agree with you. What we're listening to, how we're using touch in our lives, You know the difference between a touch that doesn't feel good and a touch that is soothing and harmonious to the body. Scents, aromatherapy is huge. I know everybody on this call has heard of aromatherapy before, and Western science is now proving to us that it's clear that there's a very clear connection between the scents in our environment and the hormonal balances within our body. So for example, the use of something like lavender has been proven to lower cortisol levels, cortisol being the stress hormone. And so all of the senses, how we use the senses, can lead to different kinds of causes of disease in the mind, the body, or the spirit. The second cause of disease is the failure of the intellect. And so what this means here is we know what's good for us. Actually, I think most of us know what is good for us, but more often than not, we will make decisions to do things that are disharmonious for our well-being. For example, we know that when we watch a violent movie, we may have nightmares at night and we may not be able to sleep well. And we know what will happen when we don't sleep well. We're not going to get the good restorative rest that we need to repair the tissues of the body, to repair the brain cells, to then move about our day so that we are more harmonious and that we're building good, nourishing habits and tissues so that we do not fall victim to disease. Same thing, we all know that eating potato chips, ice cream, and cake for dinner is probably not going to be very good for us, but sometimes we choose to do it, right? Mm-hmm. We make these decisions that we know are not harmonious for our body. And that is the failure of the intellect. It's the difference between listening to the whispers of our soul and oftentimes the screams of our ego. Our ego will tell us, you can have that extra piece of cake. You can watch that violent movie. You can listen to that really angry rock music or whatever it is. Even though we know that in the end, it's not going to make us feel better. Whereas the whispers of the soul will tell us that we need to eat the foods that are harmonious for our well-being. We need to make sure we're not watching things that are going to be vitiating to our mental state. And we need to be doing things that help bring us into a more harmonious balance. And then finally, time and motion. So time and motion, we all know what we all know what linear time is, right? So there's seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, years, months. We can do nothing about linear time. The solar and lunar cycles are there. They're going to keep going and we can't change it. We're also familiar with biological time, however, and biological time is something that we have control over. So this is literally the aging process. And the relationship between time and motion is that oftentimes we see so much motion, in particular in the mind, that we can see the biological time process start to speed up. Aging will start to speed up when motion is in excess, right? And so it probably doesn't come as a surprise that one of the main therapeutic treatments that we offer in Ayurveda is meditation, because meditation will help us to slow down that motion, to slow down that biological time clock, and put us into a more harmonious state of balance, right? Help us maintain our well-being and help us keep us in a place where we're not speeding up the biological clock. The same thing goes for motion in terms of motion in the body. A lot of people don't get enough motion. Some people get too much motion in the body. There's both extremes. I think nowadays, unfortunately, we're in a place where we're not getting enough motion in the body. And when we're not getting enough motion in the body, we are also speeding up the biological clock. So the right amount of exercise and the right amount of mental meditation to both speed us up physically and then slow us down mentally is key. And so these three areas were considered the basic causes of disease in Ayurveda as it was devised thousands and thousands of years ago, and we still see this today, which I think is fascinating. Of course, there are other causes of disease that would be considered karmic in Ayurveda, but really are biological. So genetic diseases, for example, that you might inherit, those are there as well. And then we also have the primordial cause of disease. And so Ayurvedic is very much a spiritual practice. And so the primordial cause of disease is always forgetting our true nature as spirit. We often get caught up in the dramas of our own mind, or the dramas of the current environment, or the dramas of whatever circumstances are surrounding us here in this moment. And then we over-identify with, I am this, or I am feeling that way. You know, you put the label on whatever job it is that you do. You know, I'm a health counselor, I'm a yoga teacher, I'm an engineer, I'm a physician, I'm a truck driver, whatever that is, you often start to label yourself as one thing, and you start to forget that in fact you have this true nature of spirit. You're this whole divine being, that you are connected to this greater sense of divinity. And really, we don't need to get caught up in the dramas. Does it happen? Absolutely. It happens to me every day. I think it probably happens to all of you. But we have to be able to come back to that sense of, I am not this body, I am not this mind, I am true and whole spirit, and I connect with something larger than the current dramas that live in my life. So let's get into the nitty gritty of Ayurveda and the science behind it. So this is the science of the 5 elements. And you're familiar with the 5 elements, but we'll go over them very quickly. First, we have the earth element, and we have the beautiful water element. We have the fire element, and we have air element. Finally, the 5th element that is a little bit more disputed and misunderstood sometimes, I think, is the ether element. And all the ether element is the element that holds all the other elements in place. So it's the container. It's the expansive space in which earth, water, fire, and air can actually exist. So the cosmos has to have some sort of element that holds everything else in place, and that's where we see the ether element. So let's talk a little bit about the qualities of the 5 elements, because in Ayurveda, it's not just enough to say that I have a lot of fire in my body, or I have a lot of earth in my body, or I have a lot of water in my body. We have to actually understand what that means. And so the qualities, there's actually 20 different qualities, but the 4 most important qualities that we look at in Ayurveda are whether or not you're running hot or cold, moist or dry, heavy or light, and stable or mobile. And this can be both in body and mind, okay? So this is both subtle and physical realms. When we look at the earth element, it is very cold, it is dry, it is heavy, and it is stable. And so if you often feel that you have a lot of cold, dry, heavy, and stable qualities in your body or in your mind, you may have a lot of earth element in your body. So as we go through these, it's worth it to start thinking about, do I identify with that? So you can start to understand what your constitutional makeup is. The water element is also cold. It is moist, of course, because it's water. It's also very heavy, and it's mobile. It's mobile in the sense that it flows, right? The oceans flow, the rivers flow. We know that they're always constantly moving. The fire element, probably not surprising that it's hot. It's very dry. If you've ever been near a fire, you've probably noticed that you yourself start to dry out, your mucous membranes start to dry out, your nose gets dry, your eyes gets dry. It's very light. We know that fire is not a very heavy thing. And it's also mobile, but it's mobile in the sense that it cuts straight. It cuts straight through. So if you've ever been near or around or watched a forest fire, that forest fire is oftentimes just going to completely clear a field or completely clear a bunch of trees because it burns straight. And so that's the mobility of the fire element. It's incredibly sharp in that sense. The air element is very cold, it is very dry, it is very light, and it is incredibly mobile. Now, mobile here for the air element actually refers to great variability in mobility. So if you've ever been in a windstorm, very rarely is the wind just blowing one way. It might be going in north, south, east, or west, but it's oftentimes kind of all over the place, kind of like in a hurricane. It's very variable in the type of mobility that it offers. And then finally, the ether element is also cold, dry, light, and mobile. But the mobility of the ether element is actually expansive. So it moves outward. It grows so that it can hold the container for the space of all the other elements. And so when we start to see the elements and how they show up and we understand the qualities, the ancient sages that practiced Ayurveda, or the rishis as we call them, were looking at people and they were looking at the environment and they were saying to themselves, you know, this is so interesting. We are seeing these qualities in the environment and we're seeing these qualities in people. And based on their understanding of how the elements worked and what they were seeing in the environment and they were seeing in human beings, they came up with the 3 constitutional types, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And so it was very common for both the air and the ether element to combine together to create what we call a Vata dosha, or a Vata type constitution. It was also common for fire and just a little bit of water to combine together to create what we call the Pitta constitution. Okay, so this is one of the constitution that tends to run a lot hotter. And then the Kapha constitution was the combination of earth and water coming together. And this is where we see a lot more heaviness, a lot more mobility in terms of flowing, more stability, and more groundedness. And of course, Vata is cold, light, dry, and mobile. Hot. Pitta is hot, a little moist, not quite as moist as the Kapha dosha, light and mobile. And Kapha dosha, cold, cold, heavy, and stable, as well as mobile. Okay, Vata dosha. So let's get very specific about what the doshas look like. So now it's even more important for you to start thinking about for yourself how you're feeling and the qualities in your body, right? So Vata dosha is always going to be cold, light, dry, and mobile. So do you feel a lot of cold qualities in your body? The person here in this picture, for those of you who can actually see it, she's wrapped up in a scarf, she's got her hat on, and even though it's snowing outside, she would probably still have that scarf and that hat on even when she went indoors, because she tends to run very, very cold, right? So even when it's summer and it's 90 degrees out, she's inside and she's probably wrapping up because she has a tendency to run cold. In other words, her circulation isn't as mobile as it would be for somebody who had a lot more heat running through their body. It is very light. We often see that people of Vata dosha nature are lighter in general. Their bones are lighter, their structure is lighter, they have a lot of lighter features. And that's not in terms of color, but it's in terms of the structure. For example, their noses will be thinner, right? So it looks like a much lighter nose. Their lips will be thinner. Their eyes will be thinner. Their fingers will be thinner. And then dryness. Do you have a lot of dryness in your skin? Do you have very dry hair? Do you have dryness internally? We'll talk about how this shows up in terms of digestion and other issues, but dryness leads to a lot of imbalances in the body. And then mobility. The Vata dosha will be incredibly mobile in the sense that it's very hard for them to stay focused and grounded because they're constantly kind of moving around and wanting to do different things and attracted to a lot of different interests. Also a lot of mobility in the mind. We'll see that the Vata dosha has a tendency towards all sorts of imbalances that have a lot to do with mobility in the mind. So thinking for yourself, is this something that often shows up in you? The beauty of the Vata dosha is that it's often very open to new ideas because it's got all of that lightness and that mobility. It's interested in a lot of different things. And so it'll often look for creative solutions to how to solve problems. It will be very enthusiastic. It's your biggest cheerleader, right? The person who's always going to cheer you on and encourage you to go off and do new things. Very energetic, spontaneous, and incredibly witty, quick-witted, right? So that quickness of the mobility of Vata dosha is where the wittiness comes from. On the flip side, these are the cold, light, dry, and mobile emotions that we were talking about. We see a lot of high anxiety in people with either a Vata dosha constitution or a lot of Vata dosha imbalances that they have taken in through disharmonious use of their senses over time. Also fearful, right? Being fearful is a very cold emotion, right? And that kind of makes sense. You don't feel warm and fuzzy when you're fearful. You're kind of cold, you're dry, you're a little bit more disengaged, right? Scattered. The Vata dosha is always going to be a little bit more scattered because their interests are very varied, and then they become a little bit unpredictable and unreliable, right? And so if you ever had a good Vata dosha friend who you would go to parties with, they almost always showed up late. They never called you on time. They never did the right things. It's not that they meant to hurt you, but it just wasn't in their nature to necessarily be more reliable. And then when we think about the Vata dosha in the body, how it actually shows up in the body, it is very common for Vata dosha with that cold, light, dry, mobile nature to exude a lot of pain. There's just a lot of pain. When things are cold and light and dry, they're not warm and moist and unctuous and building good, strong, nourishing tissues. Therefore, we'll see a lot more pain in the body. arthritis is one, probably one of the best examples of where we see Vata dosha starting to take over in the body. There's a lot of pitta because of the inflammation that's built into there as well, but pain is always going to be an issue with Vata dosha. Systemic dryness throughout the body, which we talked about, you'll feel it in your skin, you'll feel it in your joints, you'll feel it in a lot of other places. Constipation. Constipation is a result of excess dryness in the elimination tract, primarily in the large intestine. Okay, it will often start in the stomach and the small intestine, but once we get into the large intestine, everything starts to dry out, and that's usually where we see constipation start to build. Gas is air element, right? I think this makes sense. And gas is usually a function of an inability to digest our food well. And we often don't digest our food well, especially in a Vata dosha scenario, because we don't have enough of the opposite qualities that don't exacerbate Vata dosha. And otherwise, we need more warmth, we need more heaviness, we need less drying and more unctuousness, we need more oiliness. And then we need a lot more stability so that we don't produce as much gas and distension in the body. And then in the mind, insomnia and fatigue will start to come about, especially if we haven't addressed the physical body issues. It's not uncommon for me to see with clients who are dealing with chronic constipation, gas, distension, to also be suffering from chronic anxiety, insomnia, and fatigue. Okay, that mobile quality of Vata dosha is often going to push people into a state of total drying out, right? And when you're completely dried out, you're going to get to a place where you just don't have enough energy. You don't have enough what we call in Ayurveda ojas. You don't have the strong energy and vitality of your body, also translated as immunity, to keep yourself strong and moving and capable of fulfilling all the things that you want to fulfill. So this is the Vata dosha. This is how it shows up in the mind and in the body more often than not. So do think for yourself if Vata dosha is something that's very common for you. Let's talk a little bit about Pitta dosha. And so again, for those of you who are on the phone and you can't see the picture, we've got a woman here in her bathing suit, and she's sitting outside on a ski slope in the snow. And the reason that's symbolic of the Pitta dosha is because no matter where she is going to run hot. She is just always going to be hot. So she can be in her bikini on a ski slope because she is very comfortable doing that. And so you want to think for yourself, am I somebody who tends to run hot? And now oftentimes, sometimes women, depending on the time of life that they're in, will say, well, I run hot right now, so I must have Pitta dosha. But you want to think through the course of your life, did you tend to always run hot? Right? So then you've got a faster circulatory system, right? Your circulation moves a little bit faster and you are automatically more of a warm body. Think about how you sleep. Do you get very warm when you're sleeping, when you're not even moving? When the digestive processes are still working and metabolism is still churning and you're still running hot while you're sleeping, you're probably more of a Pitta dosha. Pitta is also light in that their features aren't as thin as Vata dosha. They're a little bit more moderate. And they tend to also stay very stable in terms of their weight throughout their lifetime. They don't often gain a lot of weight or lose a lot of weight. They'll stay very stable, very moderate, and it's a little bit easier for them to put on muscle. A little bit moist, and what we mean by that is the Pitta dosha has a tendency to run oily. So for you, when you want to think for yourself, do I have very oily skin? Do I have very oily hair? Was I very susceptible to things like acne when I was younger or as I got older? That's often a Pitta dosha type characteristic. And then mobility. So Pitta dosha mobility, if you remember that picture of the fire always burns straight. And so Pitta type mobility is always one that's going to be very directed and very engaged in getting something accomplished. It's less of the Vata type mobility, which is like, there are many different things I could be doing in the world and I'm going to do all of them. The mobility of Pitta dosha is very straight and very focused. And so we see here that some of the best characteristics of the Pitta dosha is that focus, driven, passionate, organized, very prepared, and very accomplished nature of the Pitta dosha. These are the CEOs of the world. These are the heads of households. These are the people who are running things. These are the people that you go to when you want something accomplished and you want it done right and you want it done soon. The Pitta dosha is always going to get it right. But that very hot nature and that very sort of mobile, wanting to achieve nature is also going to push the Pitta dosha into a place where they become often very angry, very judgmental, very critical, right? And if you just think about those three words, you can feel the heat behind them. I mean, think for yourself how you feel internally when you get angry, judgmental, critical. You feel the heat start to rise in your body, right? And so that is a Pitta dosha characteristic that's happening. Also, hyper-focus can become very controlling and a little bit jealous. And it's not just because of the heat, but because Pittas generally do know what's right. And they want everybody else to follow their lead. And when that doesn't happen, they have a tendency to go into that hyper-focused state where they're going to make everybody sort of march to their rhythm. Now, in the body, the way Pitta dosha will show up, number one chief complaint, inflammation. We see it, actually, we see inflammation nowadays in all of the doshas because most of the imbalances that we're seeing in people's bodies now are coming from places of inflammation. They're being pushed by inflammation, mostly because the cells don't have time to repair anymore like they used to, and we're not nourishing our bodies with the good foods that help them repair. We're eating more processed foods and processed sugars and things like that that are pushing more inflammation in the body. That said, you want to think for yourself, did I always have a tendency towards inflammation in the body, right? You're running hot, and so maybe you've got inflamed joints, maybe you've got an inflamed tooth, maybe you have a tendency towards red eyes, maybe you've got inflamed nasal passages that give you sinusitis or something like that. Then you know that Pitta dosha is probably something that's more characteristic for you. Fever, when a Pitta dosha goes out of balance, one of the first things that we'll see is fever, and it'll go high. And this may not be a super high fever. This might not be 101, 102, but a Pitta dosha will start to run hot above 99 or 100 degrees pretty easily, much easier than the Vata dosha will. Burning and digestion is the number one chief complaint in terms of digestive and eliminatory type issues. And then also diarrhea. And what diarrhea means here, we often think of diarrhea as being very watery. It's really any increase in the frequency or the quantity of your elimination pattern beyond what is normal for you. That's what diarrhea is, and that's a keen sign of Pitta dosha. And then rashes also in the skin. Almost all Pitta dosha type imbalances are going to start to show up on your skin. And often these things will show up together kind of at the same time. So if you have burning indigestion and then suddenly you start to see that you've got red bumps on your skin, like maybe on your chest, maybe on your arms, that's when you know that you've got too much heat running through the body. And then Pitta dosha is always going to be more susceptible toward burnout. Okay, and this is because the Pitta dosha likes to get a lot of things done, right? The Pitta dosha doesn't want to stop. The Pitta dosha always wants to be achieving, but Pitta dosha is going to push themselves to a place where they are going to burn out over time. And then they'll end up in the fatigue state with Vata dosha because they burn up and then they dry out and they have nothing left and no fuel left in their tank to keep moving. The Kapha dosha, so we've got cold, heavy, moist, and stable. And the gentleman that's pictured here in the Kapha dosha picture, for those of you who are on the phone, I will tell you that, so he's got a sweater on and he's got a scarf on, but it's not super heavy, right? It's just like enough for him to feel comfortable. And what's interesting about the Kapha dosha is that Kapha dosha will run a little bit cold, but they've got so much insulation because Kapha dosha runs heavier, right? So we've got more adipose tissue. Sometimes we've got more muscle. And so there's insulation that both helps keep the heat in or the cold out, right? And so heat in or cold in, heat out and cold out, right? And so he could probably be comfortable both in warm weather and in cool weather with that scarf and that sweater on. And what we see in the Kapha dosha, the cold, heavy, moist, and stable, makes the Kapha dosha very strong, very supportive, very thoughtful, very caring, and very careful. And so if you think about those qualities of stability, of heaviness, right? that strength of the kapha dosha is always going to be your anchor. This is the person that you rely on. You know, you can always go to them and ask them for something, or ask them just to lend you an ear to listen, because they're super strong and supportive. They're very thoughtful. They're incredibly caring and careful, because they have that slowness and that heaviness and that ability to flow with the mobility that is in the water element. And they're going to take care of you. On the flip side, however, the cold, heavy, moist, and stable will also create a lot of qualities of depression, of feeling stuck, becoming obsessive, controlling, starting to attach to a lot of things. And the reason that we see this is because when the moist quality combines with the stable and the heavy quality, things start to get very sticky. So if you've ever stuck your fingers in wet earth and then tried to pull your fingers out, and your fingers were just literally dripping with mud, right? They were sticky. And so that sticky quality of the combination of earth and water coming together creates the feelings of becoming obsessed with something, not being able to let go of things, wanting to control your environment because you're overly attached to the way things are. Hopefully that's making sense. In the body, what we will see for kapha dosha, the cold, heavy, moist, and stable show up as edema. So if you have a tendency towards swelling, swelling in the joints, swelling in the stomach, swelling pretty much anywhere, you are probably holding on to more water, which is very typical of the kapha dosha. And so you're seeing that happen in the body very often. Digestion is sluggish because it's cold and it's heavy. Okay, it doesn't want to move through the digestive tract as quickly as we would like it to. It kind of wants to take its time. Oftentimes, kapha dosha will have regular elimination patterns, but they move very slowly, and it's usually more like once a day. Okay, weight gain is very easy for kapha dosha to do. It doesn't mean that kapha doshas are all overweight. Kapha dosha imbalance will oftentimes be heavy, but will be incredibly unctuous and have a lot of good, strong tissues. They do have a tendency to move into the status of becoming overweight or obese a little bit more easily than vata or pitta dosha. But having a little bit more muscle or a little bit more adipose or fat tissue on their body is normal, and it's okay. That's how they are. Excess tissue and mucus will often accumulate. A lot of people who carry a lot of mucus either in their throat or in their lungs, and that's just something that's typical for them. It's not an imbalance that they've adopted over time due to environmental factors or due to diet, are often people with a kapha dosha constitution. And then lethargy. So lethargy is different from fatigue in that most people with the kapha dosha have all the energy that they need to do the things that they want to do, right? They have all the good, strong tissues. The energy actually lives in the cells and it's strong. They just don't have the get up and go to want to go do it, right? Whether that's subtle body or that's physical body, it's in the circulatory system. There's a lot of different reasons why they don't do it, but oftentimes lethargy will hold them in place and prevent them from using the energy that they do have in their body. So those are the doshas. And so I hope that you thought for yourself, wow, am I a little bit more on the vata side, the pitta side, or the kapha side, right? So am I very airy and light? Am I very hot and also light? Or am I very like stable and cold and moist, right? So vata, pitta, and kapha. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the 5 tastes before we dive fully into digestion, because we want to understand, the 6 tastes. We fully want to understand the 6 tastes so that we understand which tastes help us to digest our food better, right? And so the ones that help us digest our food better are the ones that we're going to want to start to emphasize. That said, we do want, I do have 5 tastes here. There should be 6 tastes. That said, the most balanced meals in Ayurveda, especially once your body has started to come back into balance, are those that emphasize all 6 tastes, right? So it's not all sweet, it's not all pungent, it's not all astringent or sour. You actually bring all 6 tastes together. But when we're trying to balance the body, there will be certain tastes that we want to emphasize more than others. So the sweet taste is a combination of earth and water coming together. And so an example of this would be pretty much any nuts or seeds or grains, dairy. Those are all considered the sweet taste. And those are things that build earth and water in the body, things that help to nourish the tissues, build stronger, healthier tissues. And so if you are someone who is a kapha dosha already and already has a lot of earth and water in your constitution, you don't want to emphasize the sweet taste because it's already there for you. In fact, it may be pushing you out of balance. And so instead, where we want to put the sweet taste into is someone who perhaps has a vata or a pitta dosha imbalance, right? Because those are people who already have a lot of air, ether, fire in their bodies. They're already burning themselves out. They could be depleting their tissues. And so they actually need to build more tissue in the body. And what we'll often see, for example, in a vata dosha case, where tissues, physical tissues have been depleted, mind connection with the body is already saying to themselves, I'm depleted in the body, therefore I am depleted in the mind. And when we become depleted in the mind, it's very hard for us to use nourishing thoughts to take care of ourselves, right? That's where the anxiety, that's where the fear starts to come in. And so even just by emphasizing the sweet taste for a vata dosha in the body and starting to build more nourishing tissues, they start to notice that in their mind, also anxiety and fear start to come down because they're feeling more nourished in their body. That's the strength of the mind-body connection. So quickly moving through the other 5, the sour taste, we've got fire and earth here. And so this is also a building taste. And one of the things that we use the sour taste for is to help improve digestion. And so many of you have probably heard about drinking lemon water in the morning, right? One of the reasons that is out there is because when we drink lemon water in the morning, one, we're starting to stimulate what we call in Ayurveda the digestive fire, which is really just moving all those good digestive juices into the stomach, out of the pancreas and into the stomach, so that we can, one, start to digest our food well, but also stimulate that downward moving action of elimination, right? So oftentimes people will drink that in the morning and they will find that they can actually move things out of the body and start to create more appetite for their breakfast that morning. Now, of course, this is fire and earth. And so if you already have a very fiery digestive system, you have a tendency towards burning indigestion, for example, you don't want to do this because this is actually going to make it much worse. And so you stay away from the lemon water and you would use, it would be a little different for everybody, but you would use something that isn't quite as sour. You can just drink a glass of room temperature warm water. That's going to have a very similar effect in terms of stimulating the downward movement of elimination and stimulating juices to move out of the pancreas to help with your digestion. The salty taste, so this is fire and water. This is another one. Again, if you have burning indigestion, you have a lot of fire in your body, you don't want to emphasize the salty taste. But if you are someone who has like vata dosha, you don't have a lot of fire and you don't have a lot of water, there's a lot of dryness in your body and a lot of coldness, the salty taste is incredibly important for building good, strong, healthy tissues and helping to nourish and calm the nervous tissue. And so the salty taste is one that we definitely want to emphasize so long as we don't have high blood pressure or anything like that. The pungent taste, so this is fire and air. So when fire and air come together, you think of a forest fire, right? When the winds start to come in and the flames are already burning, the flames are going to burn even higher, right? And so we use the pungent taste primarily in the case of kapha dosha, someone who's got too much earth and water in their body, because we want to fan the flames of the fire. We want to turn things on. We want to turn on circulation. We want to turn on digestion. We want to turn on elimination. And so the pungent taste is literally your hot peppers, right? Black pepper also falls into the category of the pungent taste. And so if you've got a lot of that heaviness and the coolness of earth and water in your body, then you do want to emphasize the pungent taste. The bitter taste, this is air and ether. So this is the coldest of all tastes. Bitter is super, super cold. And this is all, most of your lettuce greens, your salad greens, a lot of different very bitter herbs are out there on the market. And you really only want to use the bitter taste if you are overly hot, you've got too much heating on your in your body, and you don't have any dryness, right? So it's really best for someone who's actually got a Pitta Kapha combination going on. Or even just now during the summer, I offer to almost all my clients, anybody who's feeling that increase of Pitta or the increase of fire in their body, to eat more bitter greens right now. It's just that if you have a lot of dryness in your body, make sure you oil it well, right? So you're going to put a lot of those good unctuous oils on there. So you can both cool down the fires of Pitta dosha, and you can counteract the qualities of vata that could bring dryness into the body. And then astringent, air and earth. So you all probably know what astringent feels like. If you've ever rubbed alcohol on your body, like the isopropyl alcohol, which I'm sure doctors have done for you before, that's an astringent. So that's going to dry you out, right? But it's also, when you're taking in astringent taste into the body, there's earth. So it is building as well. This one is particularly good for the Pitta dosha, and the Pitta Kapha combination as well. The astringent vegetables that are probably most common out there are the cruciferous, right? So you've got your broccolis, you've got your cauliflowers and things like that. And those are going to be the astringent taste. Okay, now let's look a little bit more in detail here about the 6 tastes and the 3 doshas, okay? So vata, what is going to balance vata is always going to be sweet, sour, and salty, okay? And the things that are going to throw vata out of balance are pungent, bitter, and astringent. So remember, vata dosha, cold, light, dry, and mobile, the combination of air and ether. So we need those heavy, warm qualities of sweet, sour, and salty to come into the body to balance it out, okay? Pungent, bitter, and astringent are going to be too light and too drying. And then in case of pungent, much too heating for vata dosha, because it'll heat it up and dry it out even more. Pitta dosha, so remember, Pitta dosha was fire and just a little bit of water, and it's hot, it's light, it's mobile, and it's sharp. And so we want to bring the sweet, the bitter, and the astringent taste in for Pitta dosha. That's going to help cool it down, it's going to help stabilize it, and it's going to help build good nourishing tissues. Okay, and then what increases Pitta dosha? Pungent, it's too hot. Sour is too hot, salty is too hot. So we want to stay away from pungent, sour, and salty taste. Kapha dosha does want to focus on the pungent, bitter, and astringent, because those are the lighter tastes. Remember, Kapha dosha, earth and water. So cold, moist, heavy, stable. Bring in those lighter elements, pungent, bitter, and astringent, and stay away from the sweet, the sour, and the salty. Those are all too heavy for the Kapha dosha. And so let's be a little bit more specific about how we eat, okay? So for the vata dosha, right? So this is air and ether. This is the cold, light, dry, and mobile. The keys to balancing your diet: take food in small amounts. Vata dosha really struggles to digest large quantities of food. Also, vata dosha is the one that's going to be most susceptible to hypoglycemia, or states where glucose isn't being delivered to the cells properly, right? And so we want to manage your glucose levels really, really well. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure you're taking food in small amounts and very often. So at least 5 times per day. My clients who are on vata dosha food plans, I have them eating as soon as they get up in the morning and about 2 hours before they go to bed at night. And that's going to help keep glucose levels stable. One of the things we saw about vata dosha is that it has a tendency towards more mobility, being all over the place. And so we have to make sure that not only are we eating those small amounts, we're eating them often, but we want to make sure we eat them at the same exact time. Vata dosha is always going to have a tendency to skip their meals, right? Vata dosha is going to say, I don't have to eat right now. I don't need to do this right now, right? They're going to be distracted by doing 100 other things that interest them. But we need to build in good, strong routines to help balance vata dosha in the mind and in the body. And they want the foods that are heavier and nourishing. That was the sweet, sour, and salty taste. and foods that are moderately spiced. So not too spicy, but not too cold either. And so Vata dosha actually does really, really well with almost all the spices in your spice cabinet. I would just stay away from the very pungent, kind of the cayenne peppers. Don't use those. And also stay away from very cold spices. If you want to use coriander, which is a very cold spice, that's totally fine. Just make sure you balance it out with things like ginger and thyme and basil. All of those are really good for Vata dosha. And then you also want to make sure that everything you eat is warm. Okay, Vata is cold by nature and it's dry by nature. So we never want to take foods that are cold and dry. It's just going to exacerbate Vata dosha both in body and in mind. Okay, so make sure your food is well cooked. Make sure all your drinks are very warm. Never ever drink ice water. Actually, nobody should drink ice water. It's less hydrating and it doesn't cool you down as much as room temperature water would, especially in the summer. It actually drives heat deeper into your body because it's going to make you want to hold on to more heat because it's so cold. So you want to take food and drink that are very warm and very well oiled. The best oil for Vata dosha is a sesame oil. Now, sesame oil is very warming. So if you do have any pitta type imbalances in a Vata dosha type constitution, you want to be careful with that. But sesame oil is one of the main oils that we use for Vata dosha. Sweet, sour, and salty tastes are your main taste, as we discussed. And Vata is going to do really, really well eating most proteins. Now, if you're vegetarian, you don't have to start eating meat if you don't want to start eating meat, but you do have to make sure that you're having protein in almost every meal for Vata dosha, okay? It's going to be heavier and it's going to give you a lot more nurturing qualities as you're taking in your foods. Okay, let's move into Pitta dosha. Okay, so Pitta dosha has very strong digestion. Pitta dosha's metabolic rate is very, very high, okay? And so Pitta dosha can eat larger quantities of food, and they can eat larger quantities in the more standard 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And most Pitta doshas, if you are a true Pitta dosha, you're gonna want a snack too. And it's okay to have snacks in between so long as you're feeling true hunger and not really, just doing the emotional eating, which we all do, I understand that. But small snacks in between are totally fine too. But you can have those big 3 meals a day. Now, when I say big, what I'm actually referring to here, if you look at the palms of your hands and you bring the sides of your palms together and you hold your hands out as if in an offering, you can say how much food you could actually hold in your hands in that moment. And that's the quantity of food that the Pitta dosha wants to eat, okay? And so that's what we mean by 3 meals a day. That's the quantity of food. That would actually be too much for Vata dosha. So this is specific to the Pitta dosha. And you want to have the balancing, nourishing foods as well as some cleansing foods that bring in the bitter taste. And so the nourishing foods come from that sweet taste category, the heavier foods, milks, grains, proteins. Those are all really good for Pitta dosha. The cleansing foods, those are the lighter ones, the bitter greens for the salads. You can have the lighter soups. You can eat the pumpkin seeds and the sunflower seeds and things like that. Those are all very, very good for Pitta dosha. You only want to moderately spice your food, whereas Vata dosha can go with almost all spices. Pitta dosha really wants to focus on the lighter spices. So this would be coriander, this would be fennel, this would be cumin. Cilantro is a wonderful thing to cut up and just cover over your food, eat it fresh. I do that with almost all my food all the time. I have a lot of Pitta dosha in my constitution, and it's delicious. It's a wonderful thing to do. So if you're noticing that you have a lot of Pitta in your constitution, start thinking about the lighter, more moderate spicing in your food. Stay away from it's hard to know what all the energetics are of all the spices, but if you think about, spices that are a lot heavier, black pepper is very spicy, ginger is very, very spicy. Of course, cayenne is very spicy. Stay away from those and work with the more moderate spicing. And then, of course, you want to avoid deep fried foods. This actually goes for everybody. There are very few people, and it's only in wasting situations where we go into deep fried foods. Nobody should be eating deep fried foods. It actually takes 4 days for the body to process deep fried foods. And that's really only if you've been eating clean since you had the deep fried food, okay? There's so much saturated fat. There's so many combinations of different concentrated carbohydrates and proteins that go into fried foods. So it's very hard for the body to process that when you eat deep fried foods, only if you eat clean for 4 days following those deep fried foods will you actually move them out of the body. Otherwise, they stay in the body and they start to build what we call ama, or toxins in the body. And then we start to build tissues in the body that aren't very harmonious for us. And that's where we see disease starts to rise. So everybody should avoid deep fried foods and take food at room temperature or warm, never hot, okay? Pitta dosha is already hot enough. And so when you're making teas, they have beautiful tea infusers that you can make a tea, put it in the siphon so that it sits overnight. And a tea that brews overnight will have the same strength as a tea that you brew in hot water. And so that's what I often recommend for the Pitta dosha, and emphasize the sweet, the bitter, and the astringent taste. Anybody with a Pitta dosha imbalance, especially right now in the summer, which is considered the Pitta season, there's a lot of heat outside, can eat almost as much as they want in terms of salads. That's not true for the Vata dosha. The Vata dosha wants to stay away from the salads. They're not going to digest them well. But the Pitta dosha can eat a lot of salads, especially in the summer, and they're going to digest them very, very well. And then finally with Kapha, so this is the combination of earth and water, cold, heavy, stable, moist, right? Kapha does not need to eat a lot of food. Remember, they have very sluggish digestion. So when they eat heavy food, they're actually just slowing their digestion down even more. So they want to take their food in very small amounts, okay? So if for Pitta dosha, we opened our palms and we looked at our palms and saw that this was the quantity that we wanted to eat, for Kapha dosha, we actually take away one palm and we say to ourselves, this is actually all we need to eat right now. And we only really need to eat about 2 meals per day. Snacking is fine as long as it's small. Seeds are really good for Kapha dosha. The less sweet fruits are fine for Kapha dosha. And so I'm thinking more about kind of like the, it's funny because most fruits feel very, very sweet, but I'm thinking more about berries and things like that, things that are less heavy in terms of fruit. A mango is very heavy, a banana is very heavy. And it's not to say that you can't have those things, but you want to have them in much smaller quantities. And then when you're snacking in between meals, making sure that you're eating the lighter fruits, the less sweet fruits like the berries. And you want to eat at the same time each day, as with all the doshas. The lighter and the cleansing foods is always going to be the case. So you stay away from that sweet taste, that heavy and moist, right? So staying away from excess grains and proteins and nuts and things like that. Seeds are better. The lighter, more vegetarian proteins are going to be better for you. The drier grains, you can think about things like barley, amaranth. Those are much drier grains than our rices and pastas and things like that. So you can eat grains, you just want to make sure that they're the lighter grains. Take foods that are spiced hot. So Kapha dosha is the only one that can really eat the pungent spice, right? So if you like cayenne and you're a Kapha dosha, throw it in there, right? You need that to help stimulate digestion, to help stimulate circulation, so that things are moving through the body and they don't become too stagnant. You can drink the hot drinks, so all the hot teas that you want to drink are totally fine. It's going to help pacify Kapha dosha. But you do want to stay away from oil. And like I said, everybody should be avoiding the deep fried foods. Kapha dosha does not do well with the heavier quantities of oil. Kapha dosha really wants to focus on very light oils. The oils that we recommend in Ayurveda for Kapha dosha are actually mustard and safflower oil. Safflower, I don't like to recommend too much because it's got a lot of saturated fat in it that we see can also build a lot of toxins in the body. So mustard oil is good, or just go very, very light on the olive oil. You can work with that as well. The pungent, the bitter, and the astringent tastes are what the Kapha dosha really wants to focus on. Kapha dosha can also eat a lot of salads this time of year. That's totally fine. Just make sure that there's plenty of spicing on the salad that will help you digest it really, really well. And proper food combining. So This goes for everybody. This really goes for all the doshas. And these are things that we have to take into account, especially if we're working with all the good, the right taste for our dosha, and we're still not digesting things well. We have to make sure that we are eating the bitter taste at the end of the meal. So if you go out to a restaurant and they give you, well, I guess a lot of us aren't going to restaurants right now, but if you get takeout from a restaurant and you get a salad and you get a warm meal and you get a dessert, right? So technically in Ayurveda, the combination that you want to follow, or the sequence that you want to follow with that meal, is eat dessert first, because it's the heaviest, it's the sweetest, it's the hardest one to digest. And the body is always going to process sugars first in digestion. And so once you've had the sweet taste first, then you can move on and you can have whatever meal that you ordered. If it's a grain or something like that, that's also a sweet, considered a sweet taste, and it's going to be a little harder to digest. Digestive juices are still really, really strong. And so you're going to want to eat that. And then you eat your salad last. That's the one that comes at the end of the meal. It's a little bit easier to digest, okay? Unless you're a Vata dosha, it's going to be very hard for you to digest it no matter what. And that's actually a lot of food for you to eat. But eat it at the end of the meal. The other thing is the bitter taste, because it's very cold. If you eat that first, it's basically like putting water on your digestive fire. Your digestive fire is not going to burn hot enough for you to process all the food that you're eating. If you're drinking astringent teas, such as black tea or raspberry tea, it doesn't combine well with any food. So you want to make sure that if you are going to have a tea, such as black tea or raspberry tea, that you do it at least an hour apart from any food. And if you've ever, like for example, made a raspberry tea and then poured some milk, pure milk into it, and you notice the milk start to curdle, that's exactly what's happening in your stomach when you combine the astringent taste with other sorts of flavors. And so move the teas to at least an hour after your meal. Strong sweets don't combine very well with any other food, so take them between meals, if at all. And so this really is kind of, this is the very, very sweet, like the dessert type sweets or the dates or things like that. It's hard to combine them with other foods. So take them in between your meals. And then you always want to avoid mixing too concentrated carbohydrates or too light protein foods, right? So this is staying away from steak and eggs, fish and chicken, rice and potatoes, rice and beans, eggs and cheese, things like that. If you have digestive issues and you're putting a lot of concentrated carbohydrates and proteins in the system, in a system that actually isn't running very well, all it's going to do is try to churn to process that food. And it's not going to do it very well. And so the food that we don't process ends up sitting in the stomach. It will take its time to start to move into the small intestine and through the large intestine, move out of the body. But while it sits there, it's going to start to create a toxic substance. And that toxic substance oftentimes will start to adhere to the cell walls and then move out of the cell walls and into the circulatory tract. Okay. And so when we're not digesting our food well, and this just goes as a general recommendation, Ayurveda truly, truly believes that if we can get digestion right, no disease will affect our body. And that's a very blanket statement. Of course, there's a lot of genetic diseases and things that can come to us. But if we aren't creating toxins in the body through poor digestion, there's no way that we're going to start to create toxins into the circulatory system, and the circulatory system isn't going to carry it into the cells and the tissues of the body. And so we're going to remain strong and we're going to remain harmonious. And so we've got to be able to focus on really, really good digestion to make sure that we're building strong, healthy tissue in mind and body. And the primordial digestive rule, and this is my very last slide here. Thank you all so much for listening so attentively as I've been talking here. Make sure that you eat your food in a peaceful environment, and always bless your food before you eat. So we talked about, it's not just what you eat, it's how you eat it, right? And so there's food combining rules and things like that. But I think this one is actually more important than all of the other ones combined together. Because if you can't digest the emotions that you're feeling first, right? So like say you're watching a movie or you're watching the news or you're having a heated conversation with somebody while you're eating, you haven't digested your emotions completely yet. And if you haven't digested your emotions, it's very hard for you to also digest your food, right? The food is going to sit there and it's going to be just as angry or upset or anxious or whatever emotion it is that you're feeling when you're not eating in a peaceful environment. That it's also not, you could eat all the right things with all the right taste, it's still not going to digest well. So take the time out to eat in a peaceful environment, and always bless your food. This is just simple gratitude for everything that your food had to go through to get onto your plate. You know, whether it's somebody who served you or the person who picked the carrots or the apples or the grapes or whatever it is, or the people who transported it across the country or across the ocean for it to get here. We want to have gratitude for the food that we're eating. And we want to bless that food in a way that is meaningful to each and every one of us. There's no one right way to do this, to make sure that we are also digesting our food really well in our mind and our spirit. And so I just want to say Om Shanti and Namaste. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my Dharma or my purpose here with you. If anyone wants to contact me, you can find me through my website. It's www.ayurveda.com. And I'd be happy to stick around and answer any questions that you all may have. Thank you.